If you regularly wake up to find that your pillow is wet, that you've been drooling during the night in a way that wasn't happening a few years ago, or in a way that happens more often than it used to, I want you to pay attention to what I'm about to tell you because your body is communicating something specific and important through that symptom. And in most cases, the real message has nothing to do with the drooling itself and everything to do with what's causing it. Most people are mildly embarrassed by this and say nothing about it to anyone, including their doctor. Most doctors, when it does come up, reassure patients that it's harmless and move on. And in most cases, it genuinely is benign and easily explained. But there is a specific pattern of nighttime drooling in specific people in specific circumstances that can be an early signal of something that genuinely deserves medical attention. And knowing how to tell the difference is exactly what I want to give you today. I'm Dr. Hale Thorne, and I've spent more than 30 years in clinical medicine, and I want to be honest with you about something before we begin. This particular topic, nighttime drooling in adults over 60, sits at the intersection of several different medical conversations that almost never get connected to each other in a standard appointment: sleep medicine, gastroenterology, neurology, pharmacology, and the simple anatomy of how you breathe and swallow during sleep. And the result is that most patients never get a complete picture of what's actually happening, only a fragment of it, whichever fragment happens to fall within the specialty of whoever they're talking to that day. A sleep doctor sees apnea, a gastroenterologist sees reflux, a neurologist, if the patient ever gets to one, sees the neurological picture. A pharmacist might notice the medication connection if asked specifically. The primary care doctor is the person most likely to see all of these patients and hear all of these symptoms. But the appointment is 15 minutes and the drooling tends to come up, if it comes up at all, as the last item on a list the patient is too embarrassed to lead with. Today, I want to give you the complete picture that most appointments don't have time to provide. Before we get into it, I want you to do something for me down in the comments. Tell me your age. Tell me how often you notice drooling on your pillow in the morning. And tell me honestly whether you snore or have been told you snore. Those three pieces of information together tell me more about what's likely driving this in your specific case than almost any other set of questions I could ask, because they point directly toward which of the 5 explanations I'm about to walk you through is most likely relevant to your situation. I read every single comment on these videos, and this conversation in particular tends to bring out responses from people who've been quietly carrying this concern for years and have never had it taken seriously enough to prompt a real investigation. Let me start with some basic physiology, because understanding how saliva production and swallowing work during sleep is essential context for everything else we're going to discuss today. And most people have never had even this foundation explained. Your salivary glands produce saliva continuously throughout the day and night, roughly 1 to 1.5 liters in total over a 24-hour period, though production is significantly reduced during sleep compared to waking hours because the parasympathetic nervous system activity that primarily drives salivary gland secretion is lower during deep sleep than during wakefulness. During normal sleep, swallowing also continues automatically, not as frequently as during waking hours, perhaps 2 to 3 times per minute when awake down to a few times per hour during deep sleep, but regularly enough that saliva accumulating in the mouth is routinely cleared before it can pool enough to spill. Nighttime drooling, therefore, is not fundamentally a problem of producing too much saliva in most cases, though that can occur in specific circumstances. More commonly, it reflects a disruption in one of the systems that normally prevents saliva from pooling and escaping, either a change in automatic swallowing during sleep, a change in the muscle tone maintaining a sealed position of the lips, or a change in body position that determines whether gravity helps or hinders saliva containment in the mouth during sleep. With that context established, let me walk you through the 5 most important things that nighttime drooling can be telling you, starting with the most benign and working our way to the one that I consider most important to understand. The first and most common explanation, and the one most likely responsible when drooling is occasional rather than consistent, is simply sleeping on your side or on your stomach, in a position where gravity favors saliva draining toward the corner of the mouth and onto the pillow, rather than pooling harmlessly in the back of the throat. This is so straightforward mechanically that it barely deserves extensive discussion, except for one nuance worth noting. If you've always been a side sleeper and only recently started noticing drooling that wasn't happening before, the sleeping position itself isn't the new variable. Something else has changed, and the position is simply revealing it. A position that didn't cause drooling at 50, but does at 65, is pointing toward a change in one of the other factors we're about to discuss, and dismissing it as simply a sleeping position issue misses the actual signal the body is sending. The second explanation is nasal congestion or obstruction. And this one is important enough to spend meaningful time on because it connects directly to several of the more significant explanations that follow, and because it's more nuanced than most people realize. When the nasal passages are congested, whether chronically from allergies, structural issues like a deviated septum, nasal polyps, or simply from a cold, irritation, or dry air that swells the nasal mucosa, the body compensates by breathing through the mouth during sleep, often without the person ever fully waking up or being aware that their breathing pattern has shifted. Mouth breathing during sleep substantially increases the tendency toward drooling through a straightforward mechanical mechanism, because the mouth must stay open to allow the airflow the nasal passage is failing to provide. The lips are no longer creating the sealed position that normally helps contain saliva within the mouth, and the airflow dynamics across an open mouth during sleep create conditions where saliva accumulates at the opening, rather than draining toward the back of the throat where the automatic swallowing reflex would normally clear it. What makes this explanation particularly worth understanding is that nasal congestion during sleep is often considerably more significant than a person experiences or notices during the day, because the mucosa that lines the nasal passages swells in response to lying horizontal through a mechanism involving blood flow distribution, and nasal passages that feel perfectly functional when upright during the day can be substantially more congested in the horizontal sleeping position. This means many people with chronic low-grade nasal inflammation from allergies, from environmental irritants, or from structural issues may be mouth-breathing during sleep to a much greater degree than they would ever guess based on how their nose feels when they're awake and upright. If you've noticed that your nighttime drooling is worse during allergy season, worse after a night of moderate alcohol consumption which relaxes and swells nasal tissues, worse during dry winter months when indoor heating desiccates the nasal mucosa, or worse when sleeping in environments with dust, pet dander, or other airborne irritants, nasal obstruction is very likely a major contributing factor. The practical implication is that treating the nasal congestion systematically, whether through appropriate allergy management with a nasal corticosteroid spray, regular nasal saline irrigation, using a humidifier to prevent nasal drying in heated bedrooms, sleeping with the head of the bed slightly elevated, or, in cases of structural obstruction, addressing that with an ear, nose, and throat specialist, often resolves or substantially reduces the drooling without any other intervention and without ever directly treating the saliva itself. The third explanation connects directly to medications, and this is one that most people never make the connection on, because their doctor prescribed a medication for a completely different concern, without mentioning that effects on saliva production or on the muscle tone of the face and throat are potential side effects. And because the connection between a pill taken for blood pressure or sleep or anxiety and a wet pillow 6 months later is not the kind of thing that most people think to investigate. Several medication classes can contribute to nighttime drooling through different mechanisms, and they're worth knowing about specifically so you can make the timing connection if it applies to you. Certain antipsychotic medications, particularly clozapine, are among the most strongly and consistently associated with increased saliva production as a side effect through direct stimulation of muscarinic receptors in the salivary glands. While most people in their 60s are unlikely to be on this class of medication, unless specifically managing a psychiatric condition, other medications in this class and related classes used for mood stabilization or anxiety have similar effects to lesser degrees and are considerably more commonly prescribed across the general population in this age group. More relevant for many people over 60 is the class of medications used to manage the cognitive and neurological symptoms of conditions like Alzheimer's disease, specifically the cholinesterase inhibitors like donepezil, rivastigmine, and galantamine, which work by increasing acetylcholine activity throughout the nervous system and as a consequence also increase parasympathetic drive to the salivary glands, producing increased saliva production as a direct pharmacological effect. If someone in your household or circle has recently started one of these medications and has also started drooling more at night, that connection is almost certainly causal and worth discussing with their prescribing doctor who has management options including timing adjustments or dose modifications that can reduce this effect. Benzodiazepine sleeping aids and certain muscle relaxants are worth mentioning for a different reason than the previous two categories. Rather than increasing saliva production, these medications reduce muscle tone throughout the body during sleep, including in the facial muscles that normally maintain a lightly sealed position of the lips and in the pharyngeal muscles involved in the automatic swallowing reflex. The result is that people taking these medications have less muscular resistance to saliva pooling at the corners of the mouth and less reliable automatic clearing of saliva through swallowing during sleep, and this can produce drooling that didn't happen before starting the medication in people who might otherwise never have this issue. If you take a sleeping aid from the benzodiazepine class, even an over-the-counter option, and drooling has increased, the medication is the most likely explanation, and your doctor can discuss alternatives. If you started noticing more drooling within weeks or months of starting any new medication, that temporal connection is worth raising specifically with your prescribing doctor, because in some cases a dosage adjustment, a timing change, moving the dose to a different time of day, or a medication change to an alternative in the same class with fewer effects on saliva and muscle tone can address the issue entirely without any compromise to the therapeutic goal the medication was prescribed for. The fourth explanation is one that connects this conversation back to something I've discussed before in other videos, and that's silent reflux, specifically laryngopharyngeal reflux, the form of reflux that reaches the throat and upper airway, rather than simply causing the heartburn sensation most people associate with the word reflux. When stomach acid or stomach contents reach the throat during sleep, particularly when lying down allows reflux to travel more easily than it would when upright, the body's protective response includes increasing saliva production because saliva is mildly alkaline and acts as a natural buffer against the acidic material that has reached the esophagus and throat. This is your body's built-in attempt to neutralize and clear the refluxed material, and it is a protective response, but it is one that directly produces more saliva at exactly the time when normal swallowing during sleep may not be clearing it fast enough, resulting in the pooling and eventual drooling that you notice on the pillow in the morning. The clue here is whether the drooling tends to be accompanied by other symptoms that suggest reflux, a slightly sour taste or burning sensation upon waking, a persistent need to clear your throat in the morning, hoarseness earlier in the day that improves as the day goes on, or a chronic mild cough. If any of these accompany the nighttime drooling, reflux is worth specifically raising with your doctor, rather than leaving each symptom to be evaluated in isolation. Now, a quick pause here. If you've made it this far in this video, you're clearly taking this seriously, which tells me something. Go ahead and tap that like button. If this is giving you context you haven't had before, it genuinely helps this information reach more people who need it. And in the comments, let me know which of the first 4 explanations I've described feels most familiar to your own situation. I read every single comment, every time. And now we get to the 5th explanation, the one I want you to pay the most attention to, the one that most fully justifies the word warning in this video's title, and the one that I consider the most important to understand clearly and completely, rather than dismiss or overlook out of discomfort with where the conversation goes. The 5th explanation for increased nighttime drooling, particularly in people over 60, particularly when it is a new or worsening symptom that wasn't present before, is that it can be a very early functional sign of changes in the neurological control of the swallowing mechanism and related motor functions of the face and throat. The process of swallowing, which we do automatically hundreds of times per day and continue to do in a reduced and more automated form during sleep, is a surprisingly complex neurological operation involving more than 30 muscles coordinated by a network of cranial nerves and brain structures in the brainstem and cortex that process the sensory signal, time the muscle contractions, and execute the swallowing sequence with a precision that most people never think about because it works so perfectly and so automatically throughout most of their life. The brain regions and neural circuits involved in coordinating swallowing include areas in the lower brainstem that are among the sites where certain abnormal proteins, particularly alpha-synuclein, are thought to first accumulate in early Parkinson's disease, often years before the disease has progressed enough to produce the motor symptoms that most people associate with the condition. Reduced swallowing reflex efficiency, particularly during sleep when the reflex is running at its most automatic and most stripped-down level without the assistance of conscious attention, can represent a very early functional change in this neural circuitry, potentially surfacing as a detectable symptom before any other sign of neurological change is obvious enough to prompt concern. I want to be precise and measured here because I am not saying that drooling on your pillow means you have or will develop Parkinson's disease or any other neurodegenerative condition. The vast majority of people who drool on their pillow are doing so for one of the first 4 reasons I described, reasons that are entirely benign and manageable. What I am saying is that when nighttime drooling is genuinely new in someone over 60, when it has appeared or worsened without an obvious explanation from the first four categories, and when it is accompanied by any other subtle changes that might individually seem too small to mention, then the drooling belongs in a direct and complete conversation with a doctor who can evaluate the full picture. The accompanying changes worth knowing about include reduced sense of smell, which is one of the earliest documented changes in early Parkinson's disease, and which most people attribute to aging, allergies, or nothing in particular, rather than to a neurological process. They include subtle changes in handwriting, specifically a tendency towards smaller, more cramped writing that is developed gradually without any obvious cause. They include a slight reduction in the natural animation and expressiveness of the face that others sometimes notice before the person themselves does. They include subtle changes in the speed or fluency of speech or in the volume of the voice, which may become quieter without obvious reason. And they include any new difficulty swallowing food or liquid, anything that feels like the swallowing mechanism is requiring slightly more conscious management than it used to. I had a patient, a man named Leonard, 64 years old, a retired electrical engineer who had built a career around extremely precise and methodical attention to detail, whose wife came to his appointment with him specifically because she'd been accumulating observations over about 18 months that individually each seemed too small to raise an alarm about, but that together had reached the point where she felt she needed someone else to hear them all at once. Among the things she mentioned, with the careful and slightly apologetic manner of someone who wasn't sure how seriously to take what she was saying, was that Leonard had started drooling on his pillow regularly over the past several months, something that had never once happened throughout their 38 years of marriage. She mentioned it last, almost as an afterthought, after the changes in his handwriting, after the reduced facial expressiveness that his longtime colleagues had commented on, after the way his voice had gotten quieter in crowded rooms in a way he didn't seem to notice, but that made him harder to hear at family dinners. When I asked Leonard about his sense of smell, he paused in the particular way that people pause when a question unexpectedly connects to something they've been half noticing but haven't articulated, and said that food had been tasting less interesting for about a year and a half, something he'd attributed to stress and hadn't thought to mention to anyone. We performed a thorough neurological evaluation, which informed an eventual diagnosis of early-stage Parkinson's disease at an evaluation with a movement disorder specialist, caught at a stage where the full range of available management approaches was still in front of him rather than behind him. His wife told me afterward that she'd almost decided not to mention the drooling because it seemed too minor and too embarrassing to bring up in a medical appointment. That comment, and the outcome that would have been different if she'd stayed silent, is something I think about every time this symptom comes up in a clinical conversation. I want to be clear that Leonard's situation is the exception, not the rule. Most nighttime drooling has none of the accompanying features his presentation had, and most people reading this do not need to be alarmed that they are developing a neurological condition. But the specific combination of a new symptom in a specific age group, accompanied by other subtle changes that individually each seem too small to mention, is exactly the pattern that can get missed repeatedly in routine medical care until the window for early intervention has narrowed. Knowing what to watch for, and knowing that these apparently unrelated details belong in the same conversation with your doctor, is what I want you to take from this part of today's discussion. Let me give you some practical guidance on what to actually do with the information in this video, because the value of understanding these 5 explanations is what it lets you do differently going forward. First, think about which of the 5 explanations I've described feels most consistent with your own pattern of nighttime drooling. Is it positional and sporadic, happening specifically when you've slept on your side in certain positions? Is it associated with nasal congestion that is worse at certain times of year or under certain circumstances? Did it start or worsen noticeably around the time you began a new medication? Is it accompanied by the morning throat clearing and the reflux symptoms that would point towards silent reflux as a contributing cause? Or is it genuinely new, without any of those obvious explanations, appearing in a way that has no clear trigger and that has been gradually increasing rather than staying stable? The answer to these questions determines both how urgently to act and how specifically to direct the conversation when you do raise it with your doctor. Second, when you do bring this up with your doctor, bring it up completely and directly rather than minimizing it in the apologetic framing that most patients use. Most people, when they finally mention nighttime drooling at all, Preface it with language that inadvertently signals to the doctor that it's a trivial concern not worth significant investigation. Something like, "This is probably nothing, but sometimes I wake up with a wet pillow." Framing it instead as, "I've noticed that I'm drooling on my pillow most mornings, and I'm not sure what's causing it," is a cleaner and more useful opening that invites investigation rather than dismissal. Third, if you fall into the category where the drooling is genuinely new and unexplained, think carefully before your appointment about whether there are any other small changes you've noticed over the past year or two that you've been half aware of but haven't mentioned to anyone. Anything that falls into the categories I described when discussing explanation 5. Those details, brought together into a single appointment, give your doctor the full picture rather than the fragment that any single symptom represents alone, and that full picture is what makes the difference between a reassurance and a real evaluation. So here is what I want you to take away from today. Nighttime drooling is in most cases benign, positional, or related to nasal congestion, reflux, or medication, and those cases are straightforward to address once the cause is properly identified. The first 4 explanations I've described cover the vast majority of people watching this video and can be resolved with targeted, practical interventions that don't require anything dramatic. But the specific pattern of new or worsening nighttime drooling in someone over 60, without obvious explanation from those first 4 categories, and accompanied by other subtle changes in the neurological functions I described, deserves a real and complete conversation with your doctor rather than quiet dismissal as something too embarrassing or too minor to mention. The story of Leonard's wife and what would have been different if she'd stayed silent is one I carry into every clinical conversation about this symptom. The patients I've watched handle this best are the ones who came in willing to say everything they'd noticed, including the things they'd almost decided to leave out because they seemed too small. Before you go, think of someone in your life who has mentioned something like this, or who you've noticed something like this in, and share this video with them. The symptom itself matters less than the conversation it could prompt, and that conversation is considerably easier to have when someone understands why it matters and which other details to bring along when they do. And if you want to know the 2 other nighttime symptoms I consider early warning signs worth discussing with a doctor that almost never get mentioned in routine appointments, that's exactly what I'm covering in the next video, so don't miss it. This video is for general educational information based on clinical experience and published research and is not a substitute for a conversation with your own doctor. Take good care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one.